20 years ago, Tobias Marsh built his ranch with his own two hands, each nail driven with purpose, each fence post placed with care. Back then, Ruth was still alive, and the land felt like a dream they'd forged together out of dust and sweat. But now she was gone, 5 years past, and the silence that had once felt peaceful had turned heavy like the stillness of a graveyard. The only voices left were the wind through the grass, the creak of barn doors, and the low murmurs of animals who knew him better than any man ever had. Tobias didn't mind the solitude, or at least he told himself he didn't. There was dignity in hard labor, in keeping the land alive. But some mornings when the coffee went cold in his cup and the rocking chair barely moved, he'd catch himself staring out across the empty fields, wondering if maybe the best parts of his life had been buried with Ruth. Chester was supposed to be just another hog, big sturdy good for breeding. But over the past week he'd become something else entirely. At first, Tobias thought it was just instinct. Pigs dig. It's what they do. But this was different. Chester wasn't rooting around. He was digging deliberately, forcefully, as if the earth itself had wronged him. Every morning, Tobias would fill the hole back in, and every morning Chester would return, digging deeper with the stubborn fury of something that refused to be ignored. He wasn't tearing up the whole pen like pigs usually do. He kept coming back to the exact same spot in the northeast corner, carving into it with the kind of focus Tobias had only ever seen in men driven by revenge or revelation. The dirt flew in rhythm, snout hooves, breath, pause, then again. It was as though the pig had heard a whisper from beneath the earth and was clawing to uncover its source. At first, Tobias scolded him, even tried relocating his food to the far end of the pen. It didn't matter. Chester would eat just enough to stay upright, then return to the hole like a man with unfinished business. Tobias tried putting up a makeshift barrier, stacking boards and rocks to block access. Chester simply knocked them aside and resumed, digging eyes focused, breath heavy. His snout was raw pink and blistered, but he didn't care. Every time Tobias watched, the animal unease rose in his chest like water in a well. He'd raised pigs for 23 years, seen all kinds of behavior from smart ones to mean ones, but never this. This wasn't instinct. It wasn't hunger. It was obsession. And whether he liked it or not, it was starting to spread, settling into Tobias's bones like cold in the joints. He could still hear Ruth's voice in his head, soft, patient, a little amused. Animals know things, Taub. Storms, illness, even death. They feel what we ignore. Back when she said things like that, he'd chuckle, kiss her forehead, and return to whatever chore needed doing. But now, without her around to balance his doubt with belief, Tobias found himself wondering if she'd been right all along. Chester wasn't just acting strange, he was trying to tell him something. That thought had crept in slowly, then refused to leave. In the quiet of the mornings, with only the wind and the pigs for company, Tobias had begun to look at Chester, not as livestock, but as a messenger, a creature possessed by knowledge it had no business having. By the third day, the hole had grown 3 feet deep and nearly 4 feet across, a perfect circle worn into the clay like a wound that wouldn't close. Chester worked from dawn till dusk, stopping only when the light faded or his body gave out. Even then, he'd sleep beside the hole as if guarding it. Dolly, the smaller pig who shared the pen, had long since retreated to the far corner, casting wary glances and keeping her distance. Tobias leaned on the fence with his coffee mug cooling in his hands, watching Chester dig with a feeling he couldn't quite name. Dread, maybe, or recognition. There was something human in the way that pig moved, the way he paused, sometimes tilted his head as if listening. Tobias had no answers, but he felt one thing for certain: Chester wasn't going to stop. Not until he unearthed whatever secret the earth had tried to keep buried. By midday, the tension had finally worn Tobias down. He leaned his shovel against the fence for hours, watching Chester pace around the hole like a preacher circling a pulpit. There was no use pretending anymore. This wasn't ordinary animal behavior. The pig was chasing something, and though Tobias couldn't say what he knew, one thing for sure, he couldn't ignore it. So that afternoon, with the sun baking the clay and a knot in his gut, Tobias climbed into the pen boots, sinking into churned dirt. Chester backed away, slowly, eyes locked on him like he understood the weight of what was about to happen. Tobias gripped the shovel, its wooden handle, worn smooth by years of work, and drove it into the bottom of the hole. It met less resistance than it should have. The soil here wasn't just soft, it was disturbed like someone had been here before. The first thing to appear was a strip of fabric, faded blue, frayed at the edges, but intact. Tobias knelt, brushing away the dirt with his calloused hands, revealing more of it, a sleeve, a cuff, a shoulder seam. His fingers trembled as they traced the contours of a buried shirt. Then just beneath it, something solid, smooth, curved, bone. Tobias froze. Not rock, not wood, bone. He scraped more carefully, now pushing away clumps of soil until the full outline began to emerge. Ribs partially collapsed under the weight of a century. A sternum pressed flat. A socket empty and silent. His breath caught in his throat. He was no coroner, but he knew what he was looking at. A human skeleton buried deliberately and left to rot beneath his land. The moment Tobias uncovered the remains, something changed in the air. Not just inside the pen, but across the entire ranch. The chickens stopped their clucking, retreating quietly into the coop. The horses in the distant pasture had gathered by the fence line, all facing the same direction, ears alert and still. Even the wind seemed to pause, as though nature itself was holding its breath. Chester didn't make a sound. He stood motionless beside the hole, no longer frantic, no longer digging, just watching like a sentinel who had finally fulfilled his purpose. Tobias felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. Whatever had been hidden here was never meant to be found, and yet here it was, exposed, vulnerable, demanding answers. As Tobias cleared more of the dirt, the full body took shape, arms pulled inward, legs curled slightly, head turned to the side. It hadn't been buried with respect. There was no coffin, no wrapping, no care. This was disposal, not burial. Someone had placed this body here with the intent to forget it, but the clay had preserved enough for the truth to linger. Bits of leather clung to the ribcage, perhaps a belt or holster once fastened tight across the chest. Tobias's shovel struck something metallic near the hip, and he brushed it free with his hands, a belt buckle ornate and tarnished, engraved with a faded design. Nearby, the sole of a boot jutted from the soil like a relic of war. Every object told a story, but one Tobias wasn't ready to understand, at least not yet. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't the resting place of someone who died peacefully. This was a secret, a sin folded into soil, buried deep enough that no one was ever supposed to find it, except Chester had found it. Somehow the pig had sensed what lay beneath, heard it, felt it, smelled it, or maybe just known it. He had clawed past roots and stone to drag the truth to the surface. Tobias sat back on his heels, sweat dripping from his brow, his hands caked with earth and history. He looked at Chester, who met his gaze with those strange, intelligent eyes, and the thought struck him like lightning. This pig knows. Chester hadn't been digging randomly. He'd been uncovering the truth. And now so was Tobias, whether he was ready for it or not. Tobias walked back to the house on legs that didn't feel like his own. The sky had turned that quiet orange of late afternoon, but he barely noticed. Dirt clung to his knees, sweat streaked down his back, and his hands wouldn't stop trembling. Inside the kitchen, he didn't bother taking off his boots. He went straight to the cupboard, pulled out the bottle of rye he saved for winter storms and bad news, and poured 3 fingers into a chipped glass. He sat at the table Ruth's chair, still untouched, across from him, and stared at the whiskey like it might offer answers. What he'd found wasn't just bones. It was a truth buried so deep it had taken a pig to pull it into the light. He drank. The fire it left in his throat felt almost earned. The photo albums were stacked high on a shelf above the hearth, exactly where Ruth had left them, insisting that the past matters, even if no one wants to look at it. Tobias hadn't touched them in years. Dust rose as he pulled the first leather-bound volume down and flipped through the sepia tones of history. Weddings, cattle roundups, harvests, holidays. Generations of marshes staring back in their Sunday best. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that something in his gut told him the truth wasn't done revealing itself. The photograph caught his eye like a nail through a boot sole. It was dated 1923. His grandfather, Jonas Marsh, stood tall in the center, one hand resting on the porch rail of the original farmhouse. Beside him were three other men, weathered serious, all in high-collared shirts and wide-brimmed hats. One of them stood slightly apart from the others, his lean frame, stiff expression tense. Tobias leaned in. The face wasn't familiar exactly, but the eyes were. Deep-set, sharp, unsettling even in stillness. The blue fabric in the grave, the skeleton beneath his pen, the way the shoulders had curled inward. It all pointed to this man. Turning the photo over, Tobias found names scrawled in faded pencil: Jonas Samuel Marcus Webb, Theo Pike. There it was, the name that had haunted his thoughts since he uncovered the badge. Sheriff Marcus Webb, a lawman, a man who'd once stood on his grandfather's porch. Tobias stared at the name as the realization began to settle like dust across his heart. This wasn't just some lost drifter or a stranger buried by accident. Sheriff Webb had known the Marsh family. He had stood with them, and somehow he had ended up in an unmarked grave hidden beneath the hooves of a hog. A shiver ran down Tobias's spine despite the heat still clinging to the air. He looked at the photograph again, this time not as a family keepsake, but as a crime scene frozen in time. What the hell had happened in 1923, and why had no one ever spoken of Marcus Webb? His father had died a decade earlier and had never once mentioned a sheriff's disappearance or a buried body. Tobias had inherited this land, believing it to be clean, hard-earned, honorable. Now that belief was cracking like thin ice under heavy boots. He glanced toward the window where Chester lay in the dirt beside the open grave, still and watchful. The pig had unearthed more than bones. He'd stirred the ghosts that came with them. Tobias didn't know what answers were waiting beneath that clay, but one thing was now impossible to deny. His family had buried more than history out there, and the truth had claws. The sun was nearly gone when Tobias returned to the pen shovel in hand, the whiskey's fire long since burned out. Chester stood as he approached his large head, lifting from the dirt, eyes meeting his with something closer to expectation than relief. Tobias stepped down into the hole, the earth cool and damp beneath his boots. He dug slowly now, reverently carving around the ribs, careful not to disturb what was left of the dead. The more he cleared, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a partial skeleton or some forgotten settler lost to time. This was a full human being laid on his side in a contorted, deliberate position. The limbs curled like the body had been forced into the ground. He uncovered a pelvis leg bones, the curve of a jaw. There was no mistaking it. Sheriff Marcus Webb hadn't wandered off. He hadn't run away. He had been placed here, hidden here. Chester didn't dig anymore. His job was done. Now he stood a few feet from the edge of the grave, silent as Snowfall's snout quivering faintly with every breath. The wildness that had possessed him for days was gone. In its place was something solemn, watchful, grave, and oddly gentle. Occasionally he would let out a low, soft grunt like an old man whispering a prayer. Tobias had never known pigs to mourn. He'd never seen one behave as if it knew the weight of death. But Chester was different. There was intelligence in his eyes, the kind that made you uneasy if you looked too long. Tobias didn't say anything. He just kept digging, and Chester kept watch like some old soul guarding a fallen comrade. Later that night, Tobias climbed up into the attic, a place he hadn't entered since Ruth's funeral. The air was musty heavy with the scent of cedar dust and thyme. Boxes lined the rafters, ledgers, photo albums, and one worn leather-bound journal marked with the initials J.M. He carried it down to the kitchen and sat by the oil lamp, flipping through its brittle pages. Most entries were short, weather crop yields breeding schedules. But near the middle, a passage caught his eye. The web matter is settled. We can move forward now. It was dated September 15th, 1923. 3 days later bought the Morrison plot. Our troubles are behind us. The ink was smudged, but the meaning was clear. Tobias stared at those words, bile rising in his throat. His grandfather hadn't just known about Sheriff Webb's disappearance. He'd written about it like it was a transaction, an obstacle removed. Tobias stepped outside with the journal clutched in one hand and looked out over the fields, his fields. The land he had raised pigs on, mended fences on, watched Ruth dance barefoot across under spring rain. It stretched wide and golden in the moonlight, beautiful and deceiving. That extra 100 acres, the north pasture, the stream, the hilltop with the lone oak, none of it was earned. It had been bought with silence, bought with a body. Tobias felt sick. Every board in his barn, every post in the fence line, every trough and gate and rail that made up his life. It all sat atop the bones of a man who'd died for doing his job. The land wasn't just haunted, it was stained. Tobias lit a cigarette he hadn't meant to smoke and sat on the porch steps, the stars sharp above him like cold steel. He was a man raised on loyalty. Loyalty to land, to family, to legacy. His grandfather had built this place. His father had expanded it. Tobias had kept it alive. And now he was faced with the unthinkable tear it all down in the name of justice, or stay silent and carry the sin forward one more generation. No one else knew. No one had seen the grave but him and Chester. He could rebury the bones, burn the journal, pretend it never happened. But then Chester made that sound again, that low, aching moan, and it shattered Tobias's thoughts like glass. He looked over. The pig hadn't moved. He just sat there watching, asking the question without words. What kind of man are you, Tobias Marsh? The morning broke cold and colorless, the kind of light that made the world feel honest and raw. Tobias stood at the edge of the grave shovel, in hand the earth still clinging to his boots from the night before. He hadn't slept. Neither had Chester, who lay with his massive head resting on his hooves, eyes never leaving the grave. Something still lingered beneath the bones. Tobias could feel it. He knelt beside the skeleton, brushing carefully along the ribcage, and there it was, a bulge beneath the torso, pressed deep into the clay. He dug with his fingers until he unearthed a small leather pouch, stained but intact, the drawstrings still tied tight. The moment he held it in his hand, he knew this wasn't just a keepsake. It was a message the dead had been gripping in silence for 100 years. Tobias sat cross-legged in the dirt and opened the pouch with trembling hands. Inside were folded documents, brittle photographs, and a creased hand-drawn map. The pictures hit him like a punch to the gut, grainy black and whites of men loading cattle onto rail cars, livestock, with altered brands, money-changing hands in the shadows of barns. And in two of the photos, clear as day, stood Jonas Marsh and Theodore Pike, their faces caught mid-command, directing men like generals on a battlefield. The map was worse. Red X's dotted the landscape, 6, maybe 7 of them, each marked with dates between 1923 and 1925. Besides some were numbers, initials, notes. Tobias recognized several of the locations. They weren't just empty pastures. They were ranches, some still operating, owned by men whose grandchildren ran the county today. As Tobias read through the rest of the documents, the scale of it began to crush him. This wasn't just cattle rustling, it was organized theft protected by lawmen and politicians. Sheriff Webb had documented everything: names, routes, payoffs. The cattle were being stolen from rival ranchers, laundered through cooperative hands, and sold to government contractors for military supplies. The profits were split among an elite ring ranch owners, deputies, railroad men, and even someone in the territorial governor's office. Tobias stared at the ink, so precise, so damning. Webb hadn't stumbled into a crime. He'd built a case, a solid one that could have brought the entire empire crashing down if he'd lived to deliver it. Near the bottom of the pouch was a folded sheet that made Tobias's blood run cold. A list of names: Jonas Marsh, Theodore Pike, Robert Morrison, Calvin Kellerman, Albert Royce. These weren't strangers. These were dynasties. Their descendants were still here, serving as district attorneys, judges, city commissioners. Men whose portraits hung in town halls, men Tobias had shaken hands with at county fairs. He felt a strange numbness creep over him, like standing knee-deep in freezing water. The murder of Sheriff Webb hadn't been a tragedy, it had been a strategic move. And it had worked. The conspirators hadn't just survived, they'd thrived. The web had tried to unravel had only grown tighter. Tobias looked up from the map, his face pale, his hands shaking. Chester had moved closer. He didn't grunt, didn't snort, didn't fidget. He just sat there, huge, silent, solemn, his eyes fixed on Tobias like he could see straight into the man's soul. And in that moment, Tobias understood something terrifying and true the pig knew. Somehow Chester had sensed all of it, the bones, the betrayal, the evil sown into the soil. This wasn't about instinct anymore. It was about justice. The pig hadn't just unearthed a grave. He had unearthed the truth. Tobias wiped his hands clean, tucked the pouch under his arm, and stood. Whatever came next, there was no turning back. Sheriff Webb hadn't died in vain. Not if Tobias and Chester had anything to say about it. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long shadows across the ranch, Chester had stopped staring at the grave. He stood turned without sound and began walking toward the old barn, the one Jonas Marsh had built with hand-forged nails and weathered planks back in 1891. Tobias followed, puzzled but too deep into this strange path to question the pig's behavior anymore. Chester moved slow, deliberate, his hooves thudding softly against the packed earth floor. Inside the barn smelled of hay and old leather. Cobwebs hung like curtains from the rafters. Chester walked past the stalls and up the narrow ramp to the loft above, where time had all but stopped. There, in the far corner, beneath dusty bales of hay, the pig stopped and began pawing, not like an animal searching for food, but like something remembering where the last stone had been placed over a grave. Tobias cleared the hay away and crouched down beside Chester. The boards beneath were lighter than the others, newer wood, unweathered by time. He ran his hands along the seam's fingers, finding nails that didn't match the rest. Carefully, he pried one up, then another. Beneath them lay a hollowed space just large enough to conceal a small metal strongbox. Its corners were rusted, but the latch clicked open with a creak that seemed too loud in the silence. Inside, under layers of old oilcloth, were stacks of bills, U.S. currency from the 1920s, silver coins, bank drafts, more cash than Tobias had ever seen in his life. But it wasn't the money that made his hands shake. It was the yellowed envelope lying on top of it, all marked in his grandfather's handwriting, payment for services rendered. He unfolded the letter with care. The ink had faded, but the words were unmistakable. The Webb problem is permanent. T. Pike sends his regards. The date, September 16th, 1923, the day after Sheriff Marcus Webb vanished. The letter was short, clinical, void of emotion, as if murder had been just another line on a ledger. Tobias's mouth went dry. Pike Theodore Pike had been the sheriff's own deputy, a man sworn to uphold the law, and yet here was proof that he'd not only betrayed that oath, but helped kill the one man trying to do the right thing. And Jonas Marsh, his own grandfather, had been paid to bury the truth. He stared down at the contents of the box, his mind racing. That same week, Jonas had purchased the Morrison plot, doubling the size of the family ranch. He'd told everyone the expansion came from a government loan, a cattle sale, a lucky contract. But here, lying in Tobias's hands, was the real story. The Marsh name wasn't built on sweat and honest work. It was built on blood. Tobias closed the lid slowly, feeling the weight of it heavier than any gold. It wasn't just his family that had been complicit. It was the land itself. Every fence post hammered into this ranch had driven deeper into a foundation of silence, betrayal, and death. That night, Tobias didn't sleep. He laid out the photographs, maps, documents, and letters on the kitchen table, each one a brick in the wall of a century-old conspiracy. By lantern light, he photographed every piece with Ruth's old Polaroid and made notes in a fresh notebook. He created copy scans and transcriptions to be mailed the next morning, not just to local law enforcement, but to federal offices, journalists, and state historians. He didn't know who he could trust. He only knew the truth couldn't stay buried again. Chester lay curled near the back door, eyes closed, but every so often one ear would twitch toward the table, as if the pig could sense that the storm he'd unearthed was just beginning to break. By noon the next day, Tobias had shaved, put on his cleanest shirt, and loaded the passenger seat of his pickup with a battered satchel filled with photos, documents, and one black-and-white copy of Marcus Webb's badge. The drive into town felt different now, like every mile was measured in betrayal. Main Street looked the same as it always had, dusty sidewalks, crooked wooden signs, an old church bell rusted into silence. But Tobias saw it all with new eyes. He parked outside the Caldwell County Historical Society, a building that had once been a saloon, now converted into a quiet archive of faded records and forgotten names. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and lemon oil. Behind the front desk sat Martha Kellerman, a silver-haired woman with librarian's posture and a face like an unopened storybook. When she looked up and saw Tobias Marsh, she smiled politely until he said the words, "I've got some old family papers I need help identifying." Martha ushered him into a side room lined with filing cabinets and yellowing maps. Tobias laid the evidence out carefully on the table. First, the list of names, then the map, then one of the photographs. She leaned forward, adjusting her glasses, but the moment her eyes scanned the sheet, something changed. The color drained from her face. Her fingers curled slightly at the edge of the paper. Where did you find these?" she asked, voice low and tight. "On my land," Tobias said evenly. "Buried, along with Sheriff Marcus Webb." Martha blinked hard, then sat down slowly, as if her legs no longer trusted the floor. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's real. I always thought it was just town lore, just stories my grandfather used to tell when he'd had too much whiskey." She looked up at him, and the fear in her eyes was not academic. It was ancestral. "I've been collecting whispers about this for years," Martha said, reaching for a locked drawer and retrieving a thick manila folder. "But no one ever took it seriously. And those who did—" She hesitated, then flipped open the file. Inside were newspaper clippings, unsent letters, death notices. In 1983, a reporter named Harold Dent tried digging into the Webb case. Died in a hunting accident. In 97, a grad student from Denver came through here researching cattle theft in the 1920s. She disappeared without a trace. Just last year, a retired deputy mentioned Webb's name at a town council meeting. Next week, he sold his house and moved out of state. never spoke to anyone again. Tobias sifted through the documents with slow hands, the puzzle pieces clicking together with dreadful precision. This wasn't a cover-up. It was a legacy of silence. "You have no idea how deep this runs," Martha said. "That list you showed me. Those names are more than history, they're foundations. Mayor Patricia Kellerman, my cousin. District Attorney Robert Morrison. Grandson of Calvin Morrison, one of the names on your list. Two of our current county commissioners, Pike blood." Tobias felt a coldness settle in his chest. These weren't ghosts he was disturbing. They were living institutions, families whose roots threaded through every courtroom, every vote, every badge. "If you expose this," Martha continued, her voice shaking, "now you're not just unearthing a body, you're threatening the entire structure they've built, and they'll come for you. Quietly, legally, or not." Tobias thanked her, gathered his files, and stepped back into the sunlight. The street was quiet, too quiet. As he pulled out onto the highway, dust trailing behind him, he caught sight of a black truck in the rearview mirror. It stayed 2 car lengths back, never passing, never fading. At the crossroads where he turned onto his ranch road, the truck continued straight. But not before he caught a glimpse of the driver's face, a uniformed officer with mirrored sunglasses and a jaw clenched too tight for coincidence. Tobias gripped the wheel harder. The trap was already closing. The people who buried Marcus Webb thought time had erased their sins. But Chester had dug them up, and now the silence of a century was beginning to crack, and someone didn't like the sound of it. Dusk fell like a hammer. The sky turned deep copper and long shadows spilled across the fields. Tobias had just finished locking the barn when he heard engines in the distance, 3 of them. Trucks, heavy, deliberate, rolling up the gravel drive like they belonged here. He stepped out onto the porch, the journal tucked under one arm, the satchel of evidence already waiting by the door. The first truck stopped 10 yards out. The second blocked the road behind it. From the lead vehicle stepped a broad-shouldered man in a tan uniform, a badge catching the dying light, Chief Raymond Pike. Tobias didn't need to be introduced. The jawline, the eyes, the name, it all traced back to Theodore Pike, the man who had helped kill Marcus Webb in 1923. "Evening, Tobias," the chief said too casually, one hand resting near the holster on his belt. "Heard you've been digging up old family history." The other men, county officials, deputies, a commissioner's nephew, fanned out behind him. Their faces were calm, practiced, men used to intimidation dressed as courtesy. "We understand you've got your hands on some sensitive materials," Pike continued, taking slow steps toward the porch. "Old letters, maps, photos, things that ought to stay where they were buried." He smiled without warmth. "We all want to protect what our grandfathers built, don't we?" Tobias didn't move. He felt the weight of Webb's badge in his pocket, the outline of Ruth's camera in his satchel. His voice came out steady. "You're too late." Pike's smile faded. "You made copies. It wasn't a question. And you sent them." Still, Tobias said nothing. Silence was confirmation enough. Pike's jaw flexed. "That was a mistake, Marsh. You think this ends with some dusty paperwork and a few photos. You've got no idea how many people you're about to drag down with you." The screen door creaked. From around the side of the house, Chester appeared massive and silent, his bristled hair rising along his back like a ridge of knives. He walked slowly, positioning himself between Tobias and the group of men. No oinking, no squealing. Just a low, guttural sound, half growl, half warning. One of the younger deputies took an instinctive step back. "Is that pig threatening me?" he muttered. Pike narrowed his eyes. "You've turned this whole place upside down for a hog." Tobias looked down at Chester, then back at Pike. He found the truth. "You just helped bury it." Chester pawed the ground once, deliberate, as if daring someone to step forward. Tobias stepped off the porch face to face with the man whose bloodline was built on betrayal. "I didn't choose this," he said quietly, "but I sure as hell won't run from it." From inside his coat, he pulled out the sheriff's badge, holding it up for them to see. "Marcus Webb died for trying to do the right thing. I won't dishonor that." Pike's eyes narrowed. His hand dropped closer to his sidearm. The standoff held for a long, breathless moment. Then came the sound no one expected: sirens, dozens of them drawing closer. Fast. The horizon lit up with red and blue flashes. Black SUVs and unmarked cruisers tore up the road like a cavalry charge. The trucks on Tobias's property were boxed in within seconds. Doors flew open. Federal agents poured out, shouting commands, weapons drawn. One agent approached Tobias with a badge raised. "Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, U.S. Marshals. We received your package." Pike's face turned pale. "You son of a bitch," he hissed. "You have no idea what you've just done." "No," Tobias said, handing over the satchel. "I know exactly what I've done. I've given Marcus Webb the justice he died for." As Pike and his men were disarmed and shoved against their own trucks, Chester sat down in the dust, calm now. The air was still. The century-long silence had finally been broken, not by a gunshot, but by the digging of a pig who refused to stop. The next morning, sunlight spilled over the plains like a second kind of reckoning. The sirens were gone, but the agents remained cordoning off the ranch, photographing evidence and cataloging every item Tobias had dug up. With Chester trailing behind him like a quiet shadow, Tobias led them to the red X's on the map. One by one, the marked burial sites were excavated on neighboring ranches, beside abandoned wells under collapsed storage sheds. Each revealed the same truth: shallow graves, skeletons, forgotten men, badges. Tobias stood over one as they unearthed a rusted revolver and a sheriff's belt buckle. "That one was Deputy Eli Turner," an agent muttered, reading an old missing persons report. "Vanished in 24. They said he ran off with a woman. Guess not." Tobias didn't reply. The sun felt heavy that day. In the weeks that followed, federal teams combed through the documents Tobias had sent: maps, journals, Webb's letters, photographs, the strongbox. DNA testing confirmed identities: 6 men, 3 lawmen, 1 journalist, a tax auditor, and a livestock inspector. All had disappeared between 1923 and 1925. Each had been investigating or reporting on cattle theft and land fraud. Their files had been lost, their cases closed, their names erased. But the truth had waited beneath the dirt for 100 years, and now it was finally speaking. Chester, for his part, seemed to understand. He no longer dug. He simply lay in the yard, ears perked like a veteran who had done his duty and now chose peace. The headlines came fast and hard. Mayor Patricia Kellerman, District Attorney Robert Morrison, and 12 county officials were arrested within 2 weeks. Some were charged with obstruction, others with conspiracy money laundering, falsifying records, and aiding historical cover-ups. Most were descendants of the original names on Webb's list, men who had inherited not just land and money, but silence. Their faces disappeared from courthouse walls and local business banners. Street signs bearing family names were taken down. Foundations crumbled overnight. Caldwell County had thought itself untouchable. Now it was ground zero for the largest historical corruption case in state history. It started with a single photo a local journalist snapped Tobias standing beside Chester, the pig calm, and Noble, the old sheriff's badge, hanging from Tobias's fingers. The image went viral. News stations from Los Angeles to Boston ran the headline, "The Pig Who Solved a Century-Old Murder." Children painted murals of Chester in art class. Late-night talk shows joked that he should run for mayor. But beneath the novelty, people saw something real. Chester had done what generations of men could not. He had unearthed the truth and refused to let it go. Tobias didn't say much in interviews. When asked how it had all started, he simply said he wouldn't stop digging. And I finally listened. The investigation stretched for months, but the story had already left its mark. Law enforcement agencies across the country began reopening cold cases. New training programs were launched. Grants were funded in Marcus Webb's name. Tobias stayed out of the spotlight. He returned to his chores, walked the fence line each morning, and sat most evenings beside Chester's pen with a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand. Sometimes he still stared out across the field where the first grave had been. The wind carried the scent of hay, but also memory. Justice had risen with the sun, but so had the weight of knowing it should never have taken 100 years. Autumn arrived soft and golden. The wind turned cooler. The fields dried to ochre. Where the first grave had been uncovered, Tobias fenced off a patch of land and planted a lone cottonwood tree. With quiet donations from survivors' families and anonymous locals, they erected a memorial stone in honor of Sheriff Marcus Webb and those who fell seeking justice. Beside it, smaller stones bore initials ETRWHD, others whose names had been scrubbed from history and now returned to the earth with dignity. On the day of the dedication, the town gathered not with fanfare but with reverence. No speeches, just silence. Tobias stood off to the side, his hand resting on Chester's bristled back. When the wind picked up, the leaves whispered like voices, long buried, now finally heard. They asked him to run for county commissioner, then state senate, then a national ethics board. Each time he declined. "I'm just a rancher," he told them, "and I've got fences that still need mending." He wasn't trying to be noble. He just knew the work ahead wasn't about microphones or chambers. It was about integrity, memory, and the land. He used the settlement money from lawsuits to fund historical preservation grants. He renamed part of the pasture Webb Meadow, and every Sunday he brought fresh water to the tree by the memorial, his shadow falling longer each week as the sun shifted toward winter. It happened quietly. One morning Tobias walked out to the yard and found Chester lying near the porch, curled up beneath the last warm beam of morning light. No struggle, no noise, just stillness. A stillness that came not from sickness or age, but completion. Tobias knelt beside him, pressed a hand to the pig's shoulder, and stayed there until the wind picked up and blew dust in little spirals across the yard. He buried Chester beside the cottonwood tree just a few feet from Sheriff Webb. No marker, just a carved wooden plank, hand-burned with 3 words. In time, schools began visiting. College students came to study the files and walk the fields where justice had been restored, one shovelful at a time. A small visitors' center was built beside the barn, with a glass case holding Webb's badge, Ruth's camera, and a pair of worn black hooves cast in bronze. Tobias never gave tours. He let the place speak for itself. Truth didn't need a narrator, just room to breathe. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon like fire dipped in molasses, Tobias stood by the memorial tree with his coffee. He could hear the wind through the fence wire, the soft clink of cowbells from the hills. No shouts, no threats. Just the ranch, breathing as it had long before men turned secrets into legacy. "We're okay now," he whispered, not to anyone in particular. Then he turned, walked back toward the porch, and disappeared inside, leaving only footprints in the dust and a truth that no longer needed to be buried. Truth is a stubborn root. It grows toward the sun, no matter how deep you bury it.